When you look back at the 1960s, you usually get like a heavily curated highlight reel.
Oh, absolutely. The classic montage.
Right. The projector spins up, and it's always the exact same stuff. The tie-dye shirts, the roaring rock festivals, the triumphant moon landing.
And maybe a few black and white clips of marches, just to round it out.
Exactly. The standard history book treats it like this neat, color-coded timeline. It points to a few dates, lists a couple of treaties, and basically says, well, there it is. That was the revelation.
It packages the entire decade as a clean, inevitable sequence of events that just, leads directly to the modern world.
Which is such a comforting way to look at it, right?
It is incredibly comforting. I mean, we have this deeply ingrained societal habit of smoothing out the rough edges of history. We want the narrative to be this steady upward trajectory of progress.
Where the good guys realized what was right and the bad guys just stepped aside.
Exactly, and society just evolved naturally. But that sanitized version, well, it strips away all the actual mechanics of how change happens.
And that is exactly why the source document we are exploring on our deep dive today completely shatters that projector.
It really does.
Today we are looking at a remarkable text titled Tira, 1960's.pdf. And stepping into the world of this document means completely abandoning that highlight reel.
You have to. It drops you into a historical and emotional landscape that is incredibly murky.
Yeah, highly volatile and deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't a sudden explosion of peace and love. It was like a violent, desperate escape from a suffocating pressure cooker.
It forces us to examine the decade as a raw societal threshold. The text argues, very convincingly I might add, that the 1960s were not fundamentally about the specific pieces of legislation that were signed into law.
Wait, really? Because that's usually the main focus.
Right, but the document says those laws were just the visible symptoms. The actual disease and the eventual cure was a profound seismic shift in legitimacy.
A shift in legitimacy. So, like, who gets to call the shots?
Exactly. It was a brutal, decade-long renegotiation of who gets to be seen as a full person, who gets a voice in the public square, and ultimately, who possesses the power to define reality.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the source material hands us a massive interlocking framework to navigate.
It's a lot to cover.
It is. We have the sheer suffocating containment of the 1950s that built the pressure. Then we have the resulting explosion of civil rights and newly visible identities.
Right.
We've got the dizzying, almost unbelievable contrast between the technological miracles in the sky and the devastating televised carnage on the ground.
The screen in the sky, yeah.
And finally, we have the deep, fractured generational divides, where people living in the exact same house were experiencing entirely different realities.
So the document refers to this analytical approach as the Tira lens. And it is worth establishing the parameters of this lens right out of the gate.
Yeah.
Because the text delves into the most sensitive, politically charged arteries of American history. I mean, it anatomizes the civil rights movement, the anti-war protests, and the equally fierce, desperate defense of traditional order and long-standing institutions.
Which are topics people still fight about today.
Oh, constantly.
Oh.
But we are going to examine these forces strictly through the analytical framework provided by the text. Our aim is to look impartially at the mechanics of these massive historical shifts.
Right, we're not taking sides here.
Not at all. We're just reporting on how they operated, why they collided, and how they permanently altered the structural fabric of society, based entirely on the PDF.
Perfect. So think about the standard mental image of the 1960s that most of you listening probably carry around. It usually starts with a sudden burst of color and chaos.
Like a switch was flipped.
Yeah, but the thematic transition the document makes here is vital. You cannot possibly understand the sheer force of the 1960s explosion unless you first measure the absolute containment of the 1950s.
The 60s did not begin with a spontaneous riot. They began with a slow, agonizing buildup of pressure. The document actually provides a fascinating sociological term for the 1950s.
What's the term?
It describes it as a society practicing Layer 1 thoughtful action.
Layer 1 thoughtful action. Okay, what does that actually look like on the ground?
In practical terms, it was a culture entirely organized around the performance of order, the pursuit of comfort, and the absolute mandate of visible harmony.
Ah, so it was a reaction to what came before.
Exactly. Following the trauma of the Great Depression and the global devastation of World War II, there was a desperate collective craving for normalcy.
Right. People just wanted to breathe for a second.
And this manifested as post-war prosperity, the rapid, almost mechanical expansion of the suburbs, and the establishment of a very rigid, heavily advertised script for what constituted a good life.
I can picture it perfectly. It's the brand new Levittown tract home, the shiny car in the driveway, the single earner income providing for a smiling family gathered around the warm glow of a Zenith television set.
The classic American dream imagery.
But, I look at that 1950s landscape and I don't see a peaceful society. I see a heavily subsidized illusion.
A subsidized illusion. I like that.
Let me introduce like a mechanistic analogy here. The 1950s post-war economy was like a massive, high-powered centrifuge.
Okay, a centrifuge.
Yeah, it was spinning incredibly fast, generating unprecedented middle-class wealth. But the sheer centrifugal force of that machine violently pushed anyone who didn't fit the exact rigid mold of the white nuclear family right to the absolute margins.
When it pinned them there.
Relentlessly, until the machine finally started to break down in the 60s.
What's fascinating here is how the text validates that exact mechanical view through the concept of cognitive dissonance.
No, so?
Well, the polished surface of the suburbs required an immense amount of emotional and societal compression to maintain. For instance, the constant low-frequency terror of the Cold War.
Oh, right. The nuclear anxiety.
Nuclear annihilation wasn't just an abstract geopolitical theory discussed in the Pentagon. It was a daily, visceral reality.
Yeah, children were routinely subjected to duck and cover drills, right? Hiding under wooden school desks to supposedly survive a thermonuclear blast.
Which is completely absurd if you think about the physics of it.
Yeah.
And families were casually pouring concrete fallout shelters in their backyards, literally right next to their barbecue grills.
The psychological toll of that is staggering. You are expected to enthusiastically participate in PTA meetings and Tupperware parties while simultaneously hoarding canned peaches underground because the sky might literally catch fire at any second.
Right. And that external terror of the Soviet threat was perfectly mirrored by an internal terror.
McCarthyism.
Exactly.
Oh.
The era of McCarthyism and the House Un-American Activities Committee instituted a profound ideological policing.
And the text notes that this wasn't just about Hollywood blacklists, right?
No, it trickled down to universities, labor unions, and local government. Neighbors were actively encouraged to view each other with suspicion.
Wow.
In fact, the source document includes this chilling observation. It says, "The victors write the rules of shame."
The victors write the rules of shame. That is heavy.
It means your history, your personal beliefs, your very identity were being forcibly shaped by the state. Expressing a dissenting opinion didn't just make you unpopular.
It could ruin you.
It could mechanically destroy your livelihood, strip you of your security clearance, and socially exile your family.
So you have millions of people who are participating in this grand performance, but feeling a profound, quiet dissonance. The behavior demanded by society and the actual lived reality of its citizens did not align whatsoever.
But nobody had the vocabulary to express it yet.
Exactly. Take the reality for women at the time. You had an entire generation of women who had run factories and logistical hubs during World War II who were deeply capable and ambitious.
Have Rosie the Riveter generation.
Right. Yet they were now completely confined to incredibly narrow domestic roles. Betty Friedan would eventually call this the problem that has no name. But in the 50s, it was just a silent, isolating depression.
And then you examine the stark reality for Black Americans during this supposed golden age.
Yeah, the centrifuge pushed them out.
Completely. The GI Bill, which was the primary engine of that centrifuge you mentioned, the mechanism that built the suburban middle class by providing subsidized mortgages and free college tuition.
It was systematically denied to Black veterans.
Exactly. So while white America was building generational wealth, Black America was living under deeply rooted, legally enforced segregation that dictated where they could live, where they could work, and whether they could vote.
Add to that the youth culture. You have a massive demographic bulge of young people who are starting to look at their parents' lives.
The early baby boomers.
Right, and they see the house, the car, the corporate job, but they also sense the anxiety, the drinking, the unspoken compromises. They start sensing a massive gap between the advertised expectation of the American dream and the hollow authenticity of actually living it.
The text makes a crucial distinction here, though. In the 1950s, this wasn't organized rebellion yet.
It was just a feeling.
It was merely recognition. Yeah. It was a silent internal question forming simultaneously in the minds of millions of marginalized people. Like, is this all there is, or is this just all I am allowed to see?
Wow.
So the 1950s were not a peaceful golden age. They were a hermetically sealed room, and the structural pressure was building to a breaking point.
Which brings us to the moment that sealed room finally fractures. Because as the calendar flipped to 1960, the pressure simply could not be contained any longer.
The centrifuge began to wobble.
Exactly. And it wasn't happening in isolation. It was driven by massive tectonic shifts in global dynamics colliding head-on with completely unsustainable internal contradictions.
Let's map out the global stage as the document outlines it.
Yeah.
By 1960, the geopolitical world was strictly bipolar.
U.S. versus USSR.
Right. And they were locked in a rivalry where every single proxy conflict, every technological advancement carried the existential weight of potential nuclear war.
And at the same time, the global architecture was being redrawn by decolonization.
Yet, 1960 alone is often called the Year of Africa because 17 African nations declared independence from European colonial rule.
17 in 1 year. That's a massive shift.
The old empires were collapsing rapidly. And in this environment, the United States felt an immense, pressing need to demonstrate its moral superiority and institutional credibility to these newly independent nations.
The U.S. wanted to present itself as the ultimate flawless success story. And, I mean, on paper, the domestic numbers looked incredible.
They really did.
The 1960 census revealed a wealthy, heavily urbanizing nation. The mainstream economic metrics were soaring. I think the median family income in 1960 was roughly $5,600.
Which, to provide context based on the text, represented an era of astonishing purchasing power.
Oh, totally.
That $5,600 median income meant that a typical middle-income household could afford a newly constructed suburban home, a modern automobile, and a whole suite of labor-saving appliances.
All sustained by a single wage earner.
Exactly. It was an economic reality that seems almost fictitious from a modern standpoint.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because the document refuses to let that shiny, localized statistic stand without interrogating how it was manufactured.
It pulls back the curtain.
Right. That prosperity was engineered to be exclusively distributed. This wasn't accidental inequality, it was structural. The mechanism of redlining is a perfect example.
Yes. The Homeowners Loan Corporation.
Yeah, the federal government literally drew maps of cities. They took red ink and outlined neighborhoods with high minority populations, labeling them hazardous for investment.
Which legally prevented banks from issuing mortgages in those areas.
Exactly. So while white families were building equity in the suburbs, millions of Black and immigrant families were trapped in decaying urban centers, explicitly locked out of the primary vehicle for American wealth creation.
Consequently, millions of families were surviving on less than $2,000 a year. And the document astutely points out that financial stress in 1960 operated differently than it does today.
How so? No gig economy.
Right. It wasn't the precarity of the modern gig economy, where a worker is juggling 3 freelance apps to make rent. It was a rigid, structural vulnerability.
Oh, because it was mostly single-earner households.
Exactly. If you were a single-earner household and that earner suffered a medical shock or an industrial accident, there was very little safety net. The poverty was deep, regional, and systemic.
It's exactly like an elite, heavily guarded country club.
A country club?
Yeah, imagine a club that constantly publishes full-page ads in the local paper, boasting about its immaculate golf course, its sparkling swimming pool, and its 5-star dining room.
Okay, I see where you're going.
But it completely ignores the glaring reality that half the town's population is legally barred from even walking through the front gates, solely based on the color of their skin or the zip code they were born in.
And the hypocrisy of that country club dynamic became utterly impossible to maintain on the world stage. The text emphasizes how tightly braided domestic life and foreign policy had become.
They couldn't hide it anymore.
No, they couldn't. The civil defense drills, the astronomical budgets of the space race, the aggressive anti-communist purges, these were all performative expressions of a nation desperate to prove to the world that its democratic capitalist system was the apex of human organization.
But the glaring counter-narrative was domestic segregation.
Right. How does a nation project moral superiority and court the alliance of newly independent African and Asian nations when it is simultaneously enforcing brutal, apartheid-like conditions in its own southern states?
You just can't. It doesn't work.
The U.S. crossed the threshold of the 1960s, aggressively speaking the language of universal progress. But it was collapsing under the massive weight of its own accumulating contradictions.
So when the prosperity of a nation is structurally designed to exclude millions of its own citizens, eventually those excluded groups stop politely asking the country club management for a guest pass.
They start physically dismantling the gates.
Exactly. And this leads us directly into what the source document identifies as the absolute philosophical bedrock of the entire decade, the collision between freedom and order.
This tension is the central nervous system of the document. The text argues that the defining feature of the 1960s was a demand for justice.
But not like a polite theoretical justice, right?
Although not at all. It was not justice as an abstract, polite, Enlightenment-era theory discussed in university seminars. Justice became a demand for concrete, undeniable access and enforceable bodily dignity.
We're talking about the physical right to sit at a Woolworth's lunch counter and eat a sandwich without being assaulted.
Yes.
The right to walk into a county registrar's office and cast a ballot without facing a literacy test that was literally designed to be failed.
Or the right to apply for a job without your gender legally disqualifying you.
And the right to marry the person you love regardless of their race.
To understand the mechanics of this shift, we really have to look at how the definitions of these rights were forcibly expanded. The document points to the monumental legislative shifts that attempted to codify this new reality.
Like the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Exactly. Which fundamentally altered private enterprise by outlawing discrimination in public accommodations and employment. And then you have the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Because prior to that, states used poll taxes, absurd literacy tests, and outright terrorism to prevent black citizens from voting.
Right. The VRA instituted a mechanism called pre-clearance, which essentially forced states with a history of discrimination to get federal approval before changing any voting laws.
That's a huge transfer of power.
It was a massive transfer of power from localized discriminatory structures to federal oversight.
And it extended well beyond race, too. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 laid the groundwork for challenging gender-based wage discrimination.
Yes.
And then the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 completely dismantled the 1920s-era national origins quota system.
Which is a huge deal, because that older system was explicitly designed to keep America heavily Western European by severely restricting immigration from Asia, Africa, and Southern Europe.
Right. So the 1965 Act fundamentally changed the demographic destiny of the country by prioritizing family reunification and skilled labor over ethnic origin.
Furthermore, the judicial branch was completely re-engineering the relationship between the citizen and the state. The Supreme Court became an active arena for dismantling entrenched hierarchies.
The text highlights a few specific cases, doesn't it?
It does. It highlights Gideon v. Wainwright. Before 1963, if you were charged with a felony in a state court and couldn't afford a lawyer, you were largely on your own.
Which seems crazy today.
Right. Clarence Earl Gideon, a man with an 8th-grade education, hand-wrote a petition to the Supreme Court from his prison cell, and the resulting ruling mandated that states must mechanically provide legal counsel to indigent defendants.
It forced local governments to completely restructure their budgets to fund public defender offices.
Exactly. Then you have Miranda v. Arizona, which literally changed the script of American law enforcement.
Before Miranda, custodial interrogations were basically a black box where suspects were routinely coerced.
But the ruling forced police to systematically inform suspects of their Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights, the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney.
And of course, Loving v. Virginia in 1967.
An incredibly pivotal case.
Yeah. The Lovings, an interracial couple, were dragged out of their bed in the middle of the night by local police and sentenced to prison simply for being married.
It's horrifying.
The Supreme Court struck down laws banning interracial marriage in 16 states, definitively stating that the state has no business regulating the racial purity of a marriage contract.
But the crucial point the document makes is that these legislative and judicial victories did not occur in a vacuum.
Right. Nobody just handed them these rights.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Politicians and judges did not simply wake up one morning, consult their moral compasses, and decide to bestow freedom upon the marginalized. These changes were forced into existence by the mechanics of protest.
The text emphasizes that the protests of the 1960s reshaped power through a very specific methodology.
Disrupting economic normalcy, creating unavoidable visual evidence of oppression, and making the political cost of inaction higher than the cost of change.
But let me introduce some pushback here, because we have to view this from multiple angles to understand the friction.
Okay, let's hear it.
You call the status quo order, but let's look at it from the perspective of someone who built their entire life within that system.
Fair enough.
If you are a middle-class citizen who believes deeply in the institutions of the 1950s, if your entire worldview is predicated on the idea that the police are inherently good, the government is inherently just, and the social hierarchy is natural, then a massive, loud demand for freedom in the streets isn't going to look like justice.
It's going to look like pure, terrifying chaos.
Exactly. So are these two concepts, the freedom of the individual and the order of the state, inherently at war with each other in this historical context?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the text provides a profound answer to that exact friction. In the context of the 1960s, order was not a neutral state of peace.
It wasn't just things being quiet.
No, order was the active daily preservation of established arrangements. It meant maintaining strict racial boundaries through housing and employment. It meant keeping rigid gender roles legally enforceable. It meant demanding unquestioning deference to state officials.
And freedom.
Freedom, conversely, was the aggressive widening of the circle of personhood. It was the demand that the we, in we the people, actually include everyone.
So when those two forces collide, the illusion of peace just shatters.
Precisely. The text makes a brilliant observation about the mechanics of nonviolent resistance. A sit-in or a peaceful march didn't magically synthesize justice out of thin air.
It wasn't just magic.
Instead, it was a tactical maneuver designed to expose the hidden inherent violence required to maintain that established order.
I see.
When activists sat quietly at a segregated lunch counter, they weren't being violent. But when the local authorities responded to that quiet request for a cup of coffee by unleashing attack dogs, firing high-pressure fire hoses that could tear bark off a tree, and swinging nightsticks,
The state revealed its true nature. By reacting with disproportionate violence, the system completely told on itself.
exactly. The protests laid bare what state power actually looked like when its baseline authority was questioned.
And the document specifically cites the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, as masters of this mechanical disruption, right?
SNCC was incredibly effective. They stopped being symbolic, passive, future citizens waiting for their turn. They became immediate, highly tactical political actors.
Because the sit-ins weren't just about sitting.
No, they were calculated economic boycotts designed to bankrupt discriminatory businesses.
And the freedom rides.
The freedom rides were designed to force the federal government to enforce its own laws regarding interstate travel by creating a crisis that local Southern sheriffs could not contain. They took the mechanics of power out of closed, polite, cigar smoke-filled rooms and dragged them into the public square.
Making them moral, visceral, and above all, highly visual.
Yes.
And how did they make it visual? Through the technological marvel of the screen.
The television changes everything here.
It really does. The dogs unleashed in Birmingham didn't stay in Birmingham. Because of that massive post-war economic boom we talked about, those localized acts of violence were instantly beamed into the living rooms of people who spent the last decade believing everything in America was perfectly fine.
The battle between freedom and order leapt out of the streets and landed right on the mid-century modern coffee table.
Which brings us to the profound technological dualism of the decade, the screen and the sky. Because the technology of the 1960s amplified both the absolute highest, most miraculous hopes of humanity and the deepest, most agonizing wounds of the country.
The statistics regarding television adoption are vital to understanding this shift. By 1960, nearly 90% of American households possessed a television set.
90%! That's almost everyone.
The physical layout of the American living room had literally been rearranged. The furniture no longer pointed toward each other for conversation, it pointed toward the screen.
That's such a striking image.
And television did something historically unprecedented. It made national and international politics intensely intimate. It completely destroyed the buffer of geographical
You
distance.
simply couldn't look away anymore. Like if you read about a protest in a newspaper, you can detach yourself from it. You can intellectualize it.
But the text calls out the specific mechanical impact of broadcast news. When the networks aired the footage from Selma's Bloody Sunday,
When millions of Americans sat down to eat their pot roast and watched state troopers on horseback deploying tear gas and brutally clubbing unarmed men and women on the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
the sheer visual evidence weakened the psychological mechanism of denial.
Yeah, it is incredibly difficult to look at your family and confidently say, the system is fair, when you are simultaneously watching the system fracture a man's skull for trying to register to vote.
Television fundamentally altered the rhythm and the stakes of political action. A localized march in a small Alabama town was no longer a regional dispute to be suppressed by the local sheriff. It immediately became national, undeniable evidence.
But the document is careful to note that the screen did not exclusively broadcast the fractures.
No, it also broadcast the sublime. It offered a unifying mythos through the space race.
The Apollo program was the ultimate staggering expression of mid-century American confidence. I mean, you have President Kennedy standing in a stadium in 1962 declaring, "We choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard."
Such an iconic moment.
You have the Apollo 8 crew in 1968, right in the middle of one of the bloodiest years in American history, reading from the book of Genesis while broadcasting the Earthrise photograph.
The first time humanity ever saw its entire planet hanging alone in the void.
And then Apollo 11 in 1969. 500 million people around the globe staring at a grainy, ghostly image of Neil Armstrong stepping onto the lunar dust.
The mechanics of the Apollo program required an unprecedented marshaling of capital, engineering, and logistics. For the American public, it served as undeniable proof that scientific modernity and institutional competence could conquer literally any obstacle.
Right, the logic was, if the government could calculate the exact orbital mechanics required to land 2 men on a rock 240,000 miles away and bring them home safely, surely that same government could solve domestic poverty or manage global affairs.
But then you have the dark, terrifying mirror of that exact same technological prowess. Because the same screens that showed the triumph of the Saturn V rocket were also showing the absolute quagmire of the Vietnam War.
The document identifies Vietnam as the defining structural wound that ran through the entire decade.
Yes. Following the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964, U.S. involvement escalated from advisory roles to massive troop deployments.
And then the Tet Offensive in 1968.
Exactly. A massive, coordinated series of attacks by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces that penetrated the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon. The illusion of an easy, inevitable military victory was shattered.
Even though the Tet Offensive was technically a military failure for the North, it was a devastating psychological victory, wasn't it?
Yes, because the television cameras showed the American public that the enemy was not on the verge of defeat, contradicting the official, optimistic statements coming from the Pentagon.
And the mechanism that brought that war into every home wasn't just the television, it was the draft.
The Selective Service system changed the fundamental relationship between the citizen and the state.
The text has this great phrasing. The draft meant that war arrived by mailbox.
War by mailbox. It's haunting.
And we have to explain how this draft actually worked because it wasn't a completely egalitarian system.
Not at all. The implementation of student performance, the 2S classification, meant that if you had the money and the societal access to go to a university, you could delay or avoid service entirely.
So if you were working class, poor, or a minority, you were disproportionately fed into the infantry.
It was a mechanism that actively fueled class and racial resentment.
Think about the immense cognitive dissonance generated by this era. You have a society sitting in their living rooms, watching humanity achieve the apex of scientific enlightenment by walking on the moon.
And then the broadcast cuts to a commercial for floor wax.
Right. And when the program returns, the anchor is reading the weekly casualty numbers over footage of Huey helicopters dropping napalm on jungles, teenage draftees being loaded into body bags, and riot police violently clashing with anti-war demonstrators on college campuses.
It is absolute technological and emotional whiplash.
You have Sam Cooke's "A Change Is Gonna Come" playing on the radio, a song that is just soaring with moral beauty and hope, while kids are experimenting with counterculture, buying psychedelic lava lamps and questioning authority.
And right outside their window, the National Guard is deploying in-armored vehicles to patrol American streets.
It is a decade where completely contradictory realities are existing in the exact same physical space at the exact same second.
Which raises an important question that the text grapples with extensively. What are the structural consequences for a society when its foundational trust in its own institutions cracks?
The trust that held the 50s together.
Exactly. As media made the failures of the military and the violence of the state highly visible, that baseline trust shattered. The text offers a brilliant, almost haunting synthesis.
What's that?
It says the exact same technological century that successfully put men on the moon also possessed the capability to instantly televise the assassination of its leaders.
Wow.
The decade worshiped technological progress, but it grew increasingly terrified of how the state was utilizing that progress.
And because this media ecosystem completely saturated the culture, everyone in the country was essentially staring at the exact same screen, watching the exact same historical events unfold.
But, and this is a crucial pivot in our source material, they processed those events and experienced fundamentally different realities based entirely on where they were in their generational life cycle.
This brings us to a highly effective psychological framework utilized by the text. When the trust in institutional authority cracked, it did not produce one unified, nationwide epiphany.
No, it produced extreme, jagged polarization. People retreated into their specific generational realities to make sense of the chaos.
And the document likens this to 4 distinct rooms existing inside the exact same house. Let's walk through the mechanics of these rooms, because it perfectly illustrates why the decade felt so fractured.
Let's start with the first room, the child.
Right. The text describes a child in the early 60s as a sponge-absorbing structure. This is the 10-year-old who is diligently practicing their nuclear duck-and-cover drills at school.
They don't understand the geopolitics of the Cuban Missile Crisis. They just know the adults are terrified.
Yeah, they see the footage of protests on the TV, they sense the bitter arguments happening between their older siblings and their parents at the dinner table, but they don't possess the historical context or the vocabulary to articulate why the world feels like it's vibrating.
Their primary defining experience of the decade is an undercurrent of unresolvable confusion.
Then you move down the hall to the second room, the teenager or the young adult.
Demographically, this was the baby boom generation coming of age. They were the first generation in modern history to possess the economic security and the cultural sheer numbers to openly question everything.
For them, societal identity was no longer a rigid script inherited passively from their parents, right?
Right, it was a fluid concept to be actively negotiated and constantly reinvented. They looked at the collapsing 1950s structures and saw immense, intoxicating possibility.
However, this freedom was heavily shadowed. Young men in this room lived under the very real ticking clock of the military draft lottery.
Every life choice, whether to go to college, get married, or protest, was weighed against the possibility of being sent to a jungle 8,000 miles away.
Their central question is, who am I willing to become, even if it completely disturbs the script I was handed?
Exactly.
Then you enter the third room, the adult. These are the parents.
The folks who grew up during the Depression, fought in World War II or Korea, and then spent the 50s building the suburbs.
And they are caught in the absolute crushing grip of cognitive dissonance. They played by the rules, they worked the corporate job, paid the mortgage, trusted the government, and believed they had secured a safe world.
And suddenly, their college-age children were coming home with long hair, burning their draft cards, taking birth control, and telling them that their entire suburban existence is a materialistic, imperialist lie.
Ouch.
For the adult in this room, the shifting norms aren't liberating. They feel like the ground is physically giving way. Their primary experience is profound instability and a feeling of profound ingratitude from the youth.
Finally, in the fourth room, you find the elder.
These individuals carry the heavy, defining memories of the profound poverty of the 1930s and the existential global threat of fascism in the 1940s.
They literally and figuratively bled to establish the stability and the economic floor of the 1950s.
To them, the radicalism of the 1960s was entirely incomprehensible. They simply could not fathom why the traditions, the respect for authority, and the immense material wealth that they had sacrificed so much to build were being so casually and angrily rejected by affluent college students.
Their experience of the decade is one of deep, agonizing disorientation and a mourning for a lost consensus.
It's a brilliant mechanistic way to view society.
It is. You have 4 people standing in the exact same house, looking out the exact same window, but processing the data in completely incompatible ways.
Imagine a massive, loud, anti-war protest marches down the street in front of this house.
The teenager looks out the window and sees hope, solidarity, and the necessary dismantling of a corrupt war machine.
The adult looks out the window and sees a terrifying threat to their hard-won economic and social stability.
The elder looks out the window and sees the tragic, chaotic destruction of the civilized world they built.
And the child just feels the ambient anxiety radiating from everyone else in the room.
This cross-generational analysis is vital for understanding the political realignments of the era, isn't it?
Absolutely. As the document meticulously explains, when the center could not hold, people retreated into these polarized realities.
One faction radicalized, deciding that the institutions were fundamentally rotten and demanding deeper, more immediate freedom, sometimes tearing down the old systems by force.
While the opposing faction became terrified by the visible chaos, they clung much harder to the mechanisms of control, demanding stronger policing and a return to law and order.
Which is a rhetoric that fundamentally reshaped American politics and fueled the rise of the conservative counter-movement.
To make this incredibly concrete, the text gives us a vignette of a typical day in the life that illustrates these colliding realities.
Oh, the aerospace engineer example.
Right. Picture a middle-class aerospace engineer driving his Ford Galaxy to work in 1966. He's listening to a baseball game on the AM radio, deriving comfort from the predictable rules of the game, feeling like his job at the defense plant is providing a good life.
Meanwhile, his wife is at home, facing immense, quiet social pressure against pursuing her own career ambitions, reading Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, and finally finding the language for her cognitive dissonance.
And then their 19-year-old daughter comes home from Berkeley for Thanksgiving, speaking a completely new, radicalized language of women's liberation and anti-imperialist resistance.
The dinner table doesn't just feature a generation gap. It becomes a hostile ideological battlefield where nobody is speaking the same language.
Because there were so many differing, intense perspectives happening simultaneously, it is entirely unsurprising that our modern collective memory of the 1960s is filled with vast historical misconceptions.
Let's get into the mechanics of those myths, because, as we established at the top of the show, we have a terrible habit of flattening history into easy tropes.
Is that true?
Myth number one, everyone in the 60s was a hippie, a radical activist, or dropping acid at Woodstock.
The statistical reality, according to the document, is that the vast majority of the population lived very ordinary, continuous lives.
The silent majority.
Exactly. The cultural vanguard gets the camera time, but the silent majority was the demographic reality. For millions of families, dinner was still meat, potatoes, and casseroles. They were still attending church, joining bowling leagues, and going to work at the factory or the insurance agency every day.
The American kitchen was modernizing with new appliances, but cultural tradition maintained an incredibly strong, stubborn hold.
Millions of people actively resisted the cultural shifts, or simply watched them happen on the evening news with a mixture of bewilderment and apathy.
Okay, myth number two. The 1960s was an era of pure, unadulterated progress and triumph.
The historical reality is that every inch of progress was met with severe, often violently coordinated backlash. The gains came at an immense cost of human pain.
Yeah, the decade is deeply scarred by the trauma of high-profile assassinations. President John F. Kennedy in 1963, Malcolm X in 1965, and the devastating twin blows of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy within months of each other in 1968.
Hope wasn't a steady climb. It was repeatedly, violently interrupted and suppressed.
And myth number three, which I think is the most dangerous one, the system just improved naturally because people eventually realized what was morally right.
The text is absolutely adamant about dismantling this myth. Institutional change did not occur through natural evolution or polite enlightenment.
It required massive, sustained pressure, economic disruption, and severe bodily sacrifice.
The 1960s took the concept of justice, which had largely been a polite theory debated by philosophers, and forged it into a lived, aggressively demanded expectation.
It forcibly expanded the definition of who constituted the we in American society, and in doing so, it made personal identity highly visible and inherently political.
So what does this all mean for us today? Are we guilty of continuously flattening history?
I think we are. When we boil an incredibly complex, bloody, and intellectually beautiful decade down to a few tie-dye shirts and peace signs, we are actively erasing the agonizing, grinding friction that was actually required to move the heavy machinery of human rights.
This is where the specific Tira lens mentioned in the source material provides a profound synthesis. It views the 1960s not merely as a rebellion for the sake of youthful rebellion, but as a deeply painful societal movement from rigid performance toward genuine recognition.
A lantern turned inward at last, as the text poetically describes it.
The decade was the immense heat and friction generated by historical truth, surfacing much faster than the old 1950 systems could possibly absorb it.
And amidst all that heavy structural friction, the document provides these incredible, quirky, wonderfully human details that anchor the history in actual daily life.
Like the birth control pill.
Yes, you know of it. Approved of the SDA in 1960. It wasn't just a medical advancement, it was a mechanical revolution.
By decoupling sexual intimacy from the immediate risk of pregnancy, it quietly but fundamentally altered the economic trajectory of women. It allowed them to plan college and careers with certainty, shifting the entire labor market.
You have the sudden fashion shifts, miniskirts and long hair, which weren't just stylistic choices, but visual rejections of the rigid modesty of the 50s.
You have the rise of the drive-in movie theater, the muscle car.
The entire cultural definition of what was considered cool underwent a mechanical shift from polished suit and tie, corporate respectability to a raw, rebellious authenticity.
People were just trying to navigate their daily lives, fall in love, and find a job, while the foundational architecture of the world spun out of control around them.
Those specific, granular details are what make the historical analysis breathe. It reminds us that history isn't just a ledger of Supreme Court rulings and military deployment.
No, it is the specific soundtrack playing on the AM radio in a car, the specific cut of the clothes people chose to wear as a silent act of defiance, the way they negotiated the new rules of society on a Saturday night.
As we wrap up this incredibly deep dive into the Tira 1960s.pdf document, we have to return to the core mechanical truth we established at the very beginning.
The 1960s was not a sudden, unexplainable, spontaneous break from history.
It was the violent, chaotic, and ultimately necessary release of the immense pressure that had been systematically built up inside the 1950s sealed room.
It was a decade fundamentally defined by its absolute, irreconcilable contradictions.
The highest hopes for humanity existing in the exact same moment as the deepest dread. The demand for expansive freedom violently crashing into the desperate demand for rigid order.
And ultimately, it permanently changed the mechanical rules of how a society undergoes change. It destroyed the illusion of consensus.
It made it structurally impossible for the country to ever again comfortably live inside its own hypocrisies without being forcefully challenged.
Exactly.
I want to leave you with a final, profound concept drawn directly from the architecture of our source material. The text argues that the 1960s didn't just plant one inevitable future for us to inherit. It planted several competing futures.
It was the specific decade where the nation permanently lost the ability to pretend it was an emotionally or politically unified entity.
The source material states that the defining central voice of the 1960s was millions of marginalized people finally raising their hands, pointing at the institutions of power, and asking a very simple, terrifying question. Do I belong in the story you're telling?
That is a powerful question.
Think about the world we are navigating right now. Look at our hyper-fractured media ecosystems. Look at our ongoing, furious daily debates over identity, over who gets access to fundamental rights, over our collapsing trust in legacy institutions.
All connected.
Which of those specific seeds, the seeds of radical freedom or the seeds of strict defensive order planted in the chaotic soil of the 1960s, grew into the reality you are standing in right now? Right. And more importantly, returning to that smooth, sanitized highlight reel we talked about at the very beginning. When you look at the frame of the story our society is currently broadcasting today, who is still standing just outside that frame? Who is looking in, raising their hand, and asking if they belong in your story?
Something to really think about.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep examining the machinery beneath the history, keep questioning the curated narratives, and we'll see you next time.